I would like to thank everybody, the organisers and the instigators of this meeting, which I think have not, the person behind it all hasn't been properly appreciated, I don't think. And he will be appreciated, I'm sure, at some point. Of course, that is Robert Van Voren. So I'm going to give you a little appreciation of Robert Van Voren now. Dank u, Van Voren, dank u wel. We are underneath your spell. Dank you, mynheer. It's Robert that we cheer. Dank u, Van Voren, dank u wel. Dank u, Van Voren, dank u wel.
He writes novels, and that he has written some operettas, and we just heard perhaps one which will appear in his next one. Yeah. Yes.
But now to the serious part of it. What I have been a little concerned about is that so many of the presentations here are being very good, but they need to be backed up by evidence, and we haven't been served very well by evidence. I should say that Professor Berger's presentation was brilliant because he described the new venture that in Darmstadt and then gave good evidence at the end that it was working. But so many of the presentations need to be backed up by evidence. So we've been very badly served by evidence because it's mainly been bad in the last 20 years, because last 200 years, 300 years, last millennia, if we think about the history of psychiatry, it's been dominated by evidence, whether it's drilling holes in your head to let poisons out, whether it's dunking witches into ponds because they've been possessed by the devil, whether it's been mesmerism to go and cure all sorts of illnesses, whether it's been chopping your frontal lobes in leucotomy, or giving insulin coma, or giving you fevers with malarial parasites. We haven't done very well because we haven't followed the evidence. And even now we haven't followed the evidence. But everyone is obsessed by suicide at the moment. All over our country, we have crowdfunding campaigns to reduce suicide. I'm afraid we haven't got anything which will reduce suicide. Graham Thornycroft presented his data on the COVID pandemic earlier on and showed there was no change on suicide. It might have been slightly less because of that pandemic. Well, that is the only thing that we know works. When you're in conflict with a common foe, suicide is reduced. I'm afraid that Vladimir Putin in 1 year will save more suicides than psychiatry has done in 2,000 years, because that will happen as a consequence. Wait for the evidence, but you'll find suicide will go down. So what I'm going to be doing is describing 3 things where we need the evidence before we can be absolutely confident about the values. And these are the positive aspects of values. It has helped enormously. And of course, we have taken far too little notice of values in the past, and that's why they're coming back into the fore now. But the problem side of things is that, and it's really what has troubled me for some time, is if in fact you have no evidence and you just have values and you have the positive aspects of care and helping people, it can sometimes leave you astray. And it may seem obvious that you don't need to have evidence. Well, I'm going to give you 3 examples where you do need the evidence before you can say your values are correct. The other problem with values, of course, is that you can't actually test them formally. You have to put them into some sort of hypothetical construct. So the idea of this is to give you 3 examples of commonly held values, but show that they're not supported by evidence. So the first one is that people after adversity in need of support, and they need extra support, extra help is needed for them afterwards. And this was a randomized controlled trial of psychological debriefing for victims of road traffic accidents, carried out by a person I was at school with, Richard Mayhew, and he showed that after a road traffic accident, they did a study to see if whether psychological debriefing because of the trauma they'd been through would be helpful. And it was a randomized trial which consists of these elements there in red at the bottom, an hour's debriefing with review of traumatic experience, encouragement of emotional expression, and promotion of cognitive processing of the experience. And the control group also had an intervention, which was a positive intervention, one could say, but they were just saying give support of family and friends. Well, the results after 4 months went against expectations. The intervention group had a worse outcome on 2 subscales, the brief symptom inventory, and a poor outcome in terms of emotional distress. And after 3 years, it was even worse. They had worse psychiatric symptoms, travel anxiety when a passenger, overall level of functioning, and financial problems. And this was a single study, but subsequently, Simon Wesley, who many of you will know about as a highly influential academic figure, showed that in a Cochrane review that single session debriefing for trauma does not reduce psychological distress, it makes it worse. And yet our values tell us we should be supporting people, we should be debriefing people, we should be helping. And so every time we have a major disaster, people rush round and give extra support. I was quite shocked by Greg Abbott in Texas saying after the Uvalde awful tragedy there, saying, anyone wants a mental health support worker for going through their trauma, I will provide them immediately. Well, it would have been useless, quite apart from the fact that he was quite incapable of doing any such thing. So we have to be reminding ourselves that giving immediate help to people after trauma, even from specialised counsellors, may not be valuable, even though we think it should be from obvious common sense. Next one. People in crisis need the help of others. We're very keen on crisis teams. We've developed them in most parts of the world. I helped to develop crisis teams in Vasaros Hospital in Vilnius. But even at that time, I was a bit dubious about their value. And I'm just going to describe one study which demonstrates this. This was a comparison of 2 crisis resolution teams, a standard service and a new one right next door in the same city. This is Cardiff, which is the capital of Wales. And we looked at the outcome in terms of their times in hospital and their outcome in terms of other respects. And I don't want, it was an ecological case control. I haven't got time to go into the great details of it, but by picking on the opportunity before crisis teams were ever popular, we had one half of a city having a crisis team and the other half not having one. And so the case control was measuring what happened in terms of admissions before the crisis team was developed, then afterwards, and having the other control part of the city to show the outcome without the crisis team. And again, I'm sorry I've got to show numbers because there haven't been many numbers shown here, but you can see from these findings that what happened in the crisis team, the area of the crisis team, there was a 33% increase in compulsory admissions compared with 7% in the standard one, but there was a 30% reduction in informal admissions. And the whole idea about crisis teams is they prevent admissions. So they were very effective in preventing informal admissions, but there was a bit of a worry about compulsory admissions. And then if we take the bed days occupied, there were more bed days occupied by compulsory patients despite significant fall in informal admissions. So we had a lot of discussion about coercion and compulsory treatment here, and as you know, in many parts of the world, including our own, compulsory treatments are going up. Places like Netherlands, which has got a very humane mental health care system, they're going up enormously, the number of proportion of compulsory admissions. But this is one of the reasons. If you look at what crisis teams are doing, and this is the last bit of the evidence, I mentioned that they we can't reduce suicide, I think crisis teams could be increasing suicide. This is the evidence, which is not quite significant, that in the control group, there was a reduction in suicides. It's a much bigger group, and that's why there were more to begin with. In the crisis team area, we went from 1 suicide to 5. And you can't do many good studies of suicide because suicide is a relatively rare event, but this was close to being significant. So I think it would be right to conclude that crisis teams reduce informal admissions. We all know that works, and it's been shown in lots of studies since. But they increase compulsory admissions. In other words, we don't want coercion, but we're doing that. And crisis teams do not reduce suicide and may increase it. And this is perhaps an obvious conclusion, because if in fact someone needs to be admitted or looks as though they need to be admitted, and you can't admit them because they're so desperate to have a bed for somebody else, and you stop the admission, they're more likely to get worse. And when they are admitted subsequently, that would be under a compulsory order. And they're also perhaps in the interim more likely to kill themselves. So I would like you to review the value of crisis teams, which have been badly served by evidence since they've been introduced. One of the reasons why the evidence has been positive is that when you set up a new team, all the best people in your service go and join the new team, and no doubt they do a bit better because you have better staff working for them. But 10 years down the line, it's quite another matter. So the real purpose of a crisis team is not to help to relieve distress or promote adjustment, but to prevent admission to hospital. Value 3, giving more care and attention to patients with severe mental illness will improve their outcomes. And this was first stimulated by Stein and Test in Wisconsin, who showed dramatically that giving assertive outreach helped things. What was not properly recognised was Wisconsin standard care was bloody awful. There was no good care in Wisconsin. And when they decided to do these studies elsewhere, we got very different results, including the United Kingdom. And we did a similar study, a large study, UK 700 group, 700 patients, which were published in The Lancet. And we thought, everybody thought, we'd confirm Stein and Test. We'd reduce admissions. So we randomised these 700 patients to standard case management with a much lower case, much higher caseload, a normal caseload, and the intensive management had a lower caseload. And we measured lots of different things at baseline 1 year and 2 years. And the results, after 2 years, showed that, in fact, if you were allocated to an assertive outreach team, you actually had more admissions, not significantly more, and that's just the range over time. If you look at the actual figures, it was 73.5 and 73.1. That's hardly, doesn't mean anything at all, that doesn't. But it's showing that, in fact, there was no obvious advantage of giving intensive care. And again, if you look at the values of that, I remember the head of our social work service in Paddington refused to take part in the study because she said, this is a total waste of public money. You know perfectly well by giving more care to people with severe mental illness, they're bound to do better. Sorry, the evidence showed otherwise. And yet we came over to Vasaros the next year and demonstrated to teach assertive outreach to people in Lithuania. It may have been relevant in Lithuania because standard care wasn't so good, but certainly standard care is just as good as intensive care. But there is one group which does well, and we published this in The Lancet as well. We looked at those people in the study who had borderline intelligence. That means that they were on the borderline to intellectual disability, because we also measured their IQ levels as well at the beginning of the study. And these results showed completely the opposite findings. They did really well, these people, when they had intensive care. When they had more contact, they had intensive care. Those with borderline intelligence had half the admission days intensive care group than the standard group. And I think this shows the differences between those with intellectual disability who have perhaps less autonomy and less independence. They do well with the intensive care. The ones with normal intelligence often find extra contact irritating because their autonomy is being reduced. Well-coordinated mental health services A decline in caseload alone does not improve outcomes. And we said in our paper, mental health planners may need to pay more attention to the content of treatment rather than changes in service organisation. And the real problem here is, you see, all the changes in service organisation are not driven by the evidence, they're driven by the idea that they're going to reduce costs and reduce money, reduce the use of beds, rather than necessarily improve outcome for patients. So they're the take-home messages. Values are a good benchmark, but adherence to them alone do not a good psychiatric service make. Evidence should always be searched for, even when common sense tells you there is no need for evaluation. And a good psychiatric service needs to incorporate values and evidence. Thank you very much.